Then, shall we? Well, welcome everybody. It's yet another Black History lunchtime conversation, and we're going to be talking about the situation in Australia, looking at the history of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So welcome to you all. We realise in the UK it's summertime. Here in Australia, it's winter time and storm time, so things are looking all right though, and things are being tidied up. So that's an update from me, and it's great. We're welcoming Professor Sati Wakshat from Jos University. Good to have you with us. Also, Dr. Bunmi Olisan from Canada. It's great that you're with us and carrying on. No doubt, I haven't checked up this week, but your wonderful Sankova Pan-African series on YouTube, that's fantastic. Bill Hearn is working away with his current project, which is to write short bios of all the passengers on Empire Windrush. And over the last couple of weeks, several of us have been, well, a number of us have been involved in Windrush recognition and celebration. It's also great to have Caroline Sanson, who's from Learning Links International, who's been a real stalwart, keeping going and supporting all the way through these, as well as David Alston from Scotland. That's fantastic. And also Lisa Gabbett is joining us from Texas. Lisa, I know it's sometimes a bit difficult to get the connectivity, but it's great that you're able to be with us. And thank you so much, Simon. Simon does the technicalities on these sessions, and that's really good opportunity. So I'm just going to try and load up my PowerPoint presentation, if this behaves itself. And I'm going to say play from the start. Okay, so today our theme is to learn about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history. Got an apology to make here, folks, because in the same way that the Menai Strait is called the Menai Strait, the Torres Strait is also called the Torres Straits. But there's a lot of interesting information that I've been able to glean from reading and checking out on the internet, and I wanted to bring together some of those things to share with you. So that's what we're going to do today. I've been promising for several months now that we'd focus on this. Right, on to the next one. Now my computer is decidedly... Okay, so we start with an acknowledgement of country. This is important in all events in Australia and Torres Straits Islands. We respect and honour the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, elders, past, present and future. We acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this land and commit to building a brighter future together. So my journey to understanding about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their history and the traumas they've suffered. It's been really a fascinating journey to try and discover this, so that to understand though the traumas suffered after the invasion of their lands by the British in 1733 is really hard. The stories are really hard and really horrible. And now there are such efforts being made to try and come up together with some reconciliation. But there's an awful lot of damage that's irreparable. So I thought I wanted to talk to you about my journey. I'd introduce some maps. So the browny fawny coloured map on the left hand or side of the map, you can see the coast there of Australia. You can see New Zealand below. Well, these were the names that were given by Captain Cook as he sailed around various islands in the Pacific and explored the larger lands of New Zealand and Australia. The colourful map shows all the different tribes and groups of Australian on the continent of Australia. It doesn't include the Torres Strait Islands, which are to the northeast. They were originally joined to Australia many thousands of years ago, but they still form a part of the current country of Australia. The big picture below shows where Melbourne is, which is in the south, very southeast, just north of Tasmania. So you can see the big urban sprawl of Melbourne. And then you can see the Dandenong Ranges, which are between the words of Melbourne and Dandenong Ranges, the green bit there. That's where we've had the storms. And you can see the place where I am at the moment, Sassafras. But you can also see in the small map with the bright blue sea, the Boon Wurrung tribe, or the tribe who were in this area. It's a spectacularly beautiful area with a gorgeous climate and lots of sea. So it would have been a really good place to live. Oops, I want to go back one now. Yeah. So my journey to try and find out about First Australians, apart from going to events and things, was to get hold of the series called The First Australians. And I don't know if it's available from the UK, I can't really check, but it was an epic SBS TV series as well, and was just so interesting, telling the perspective of Australia's first people and bringing to life the events. It's really a very good way to understand a long and complex history. Oops, don't ask me why this keeps going that way. These are two of the presenters, Professor Marcia Langton, who's a historian from the Yaman Bijara Nation, and also Bruce Pascoe, who's a writer with Bunurong heritage. And they're really good at explaining and telling the stories about the history. But the book that goes with it is also worth getting out of the library. It's really interesting. Right. So prior to the British settlement, as you saw on that map, there were so many different Indigenous groups, probably 500 and more, but only approximately 750,000 people in total. Now, I haven't checked these figures, but sounds quite a low number, but we're talking about a long time ago. But the culture developed over such a long time, 60,000 years, making Indigenous Australians the custodians of the world's most ancient living culture, and each group lived in close relationship with the land and had custody over their own country. The word country is incredibly important, and people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders talk of country a lot, and it means their country. So one of the slogans that's been used more recently is this very, I think, powerful statement: always was, always will be, because they've never ceded, or whatever the expression is, the ownership of the land. The Aboriginal stories of creations, the dreaming or dream time, are also talked about a lot. Because the dreaming used to represent the Aboriginal concept of a time when the land was inhabited by ancestral figures, often of heroic proportions or with supernatural abilities. Different animals, snakes, different stories of different people. And the rock art in Australia is incredible, but often not respected. And we've recently had a case where a mining company destroyed a whole cave complex, and that was really just so devastating for the local people. But if you Google short films about Aboriginal history, you'll find a whole lot. So there's a few shortcuts going on in this talk. Have you heard someone ask, why can't Indigenous people just get over it? After all, it happened ages ago. There's been all sorts of arguments and difficulties, but you can see, I mean, the imagery can be horrendous. So what about the history? How our history of invasion and social control impacts today. Now, this is a really good site called australianstogether.org.au, and I'm going to, a little bit later in the presentation, use some of the quotes from that. So the first premise was that, that there was no one on the continent, and yet obviously it was inhabited. And this term terra nullis was used and claimed that the country belonged to no one, so therefore it could belong to Britain. And as in other places, the blatant denial of the people who were living there, with no negotiation at all. Now, this is different to New Zealand, where there were treaties, and I think in the US as well, there were treaties with the Indigenous people, or things that were said to be treaties. But the lack of a treaty or acknowledgement of invasion is one of the key topics that's been in the discussions about constitutional recognition since 2017. And the lack of this treaty goes to the very heart of the wound in the nation. So Indigenous people continue to feel the pain of occupation, dispossession, lack of recognition, and the absence of a treaty is an ongoing denial of the existence, prior occupation and dispossession of the Indigenous people. And also highlights a lack of engagement and relationship between the two groups of people who now live on the continent of Australia. So this whole thing about the treaty, and I'm going to be talking about the Uluru Statement, is very much discussion that's going on at the moment. So the Uluru Statement was produced a few years ago, and it came from consultation from all over Australia, which isn't a usual thing to do. The tribes from all over Australia don't get together on a regular basis. They live in their own countries and they deal with their own parts of the continent. But the Uluru Statement from the Heart was produced after people came together. And the illustration with the Aboriginal art around the edge and the snake, that's a large canvas. The statement's in the middle of it, was printed into the middle of it, and the signatures are the signatures of all those people who were involved in that consultation. Uluru used to be called Ayers Rock, right in the centre of Australia, and that's where they met to bring this together. And the idea is to have a referendum. This is what they're working towards, so that the First Nations voice will be enshrined in the Constitution. Now, if Simon can manage it now, I'm going to stop sharing, and Simon's going to see if we can play this off the Uluru Statement .org website, because it's a really interesting film. How are you doing, Simon?
Yep, just unmuting and about to share my screen.
It's okay.
Right. Can you all see the screen first?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, playing now.
The Uluru Statement from the Heart is an invitation to the Australian people from First Nation Australians. It invites all Australians to walk with First Nations peoples in a movement for a better future. It asks us to support a First Nations voice in the Constitution. This simply means the right to give advice on laws that affect First Nations peoples. This First Nations voice needs to be built into the Constitution, so it can only be changed by you, the Australian people, not the whim of government. From Australia's heart to yours, let's support this constitutional change and begin our journey to a better Australia.
Interesting. Maybe it's just a little introductory clip that there was. There's actually a longer one, Simon.
Is there? Let me see if I can trace it.
If you don't mind having a look for that.
Yep.
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
While we're waiting, can I just ask you? I mean, the campaign for that for embedding that in the Constitution. That's a current campaign, and
Very much.
are you going to tell us? Are you going to tell us how things are going and what it will take to get that referendum agreed? First of all, I suppose.
Well, it's something that's it's work in progress, and it's quite slow, and there's quite a frustration that that the current government here aren't particularly receptive. But we've also obviously had the pandemic issues, so things have been slower than was anticipated, I think, to get to a point where there is a referendum. I'm not quite sure why there needs to be a referendum, but they seem to think that that's the way forward, because the first Australians have got the right to have their voice enshrined in the Constitution, and they shouldn't have been excluded, particularly when all the states of Australia were brought together in 2000 and in 1900. I think it's 1900 or 1901. So yes, it is taking a long time.
Okay, there's several videos on the website, Liz. The link you sent just took me to that home page with that shorter one.
Oh, right. Let me see if I look through it with my share screen, and I'm not sure if I'll.
Just remember when you click share to click the box that says share sound.
Okay. Now, I think what I'll probably more likely do is to let you all. I'll send the link for you, and then you can see exactly where it is and have a look at that. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint that I was showing then, everyone. Okay. So the way that they're moving it, and perhaps this is a bit of a way to answer your query, David, is to say that throughout the year there are different weeks when there's a focus on the campaigns, and I'll talk a little bit later on about what happened then with the impact of Black Lives Matter after George Floyd's death, because that certainly moved things on yet again. But National Reconciliation Week then is every May, I think. Our Country, Our Future, Our Shared Responsibility. And there is a groundswell from the people who live here now in Australia to recognise Aboriginal culture and history, being the culture and history of all Australians, and teaching in schools is a very important element in the curriculum. There's no question about it whatsoever, like in the UK. And the explanation of the definition of personal and national identity is really important. So it explains again about how long it's been. It's a part of who everybody is who's here in Australia. Bear in mind, I've got my residency now, but I haven't got my citizenship, particularly those who seek to be part of the story of this land. Would it be me? I don't know. But certainly I'm respectful, and everything that I see that's respecting the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, I'm really appreciative of. So the Yarra Ranges, which is the area in which I live in Victoria, this is some information from their website. I think it's this one. So things that I didn't know about, so I thought this was useful to share with others, that the wars of resistance, starting in 1788 and going on through to 1930s, these wars aren't recognised in public events, and certainly they're omitted from Australia's war commemoration history, which focuses entirely on the First and Second World Wars. This has meant that lots of Australians don't understand their own history, and I'm aware that us as learning Australian history, it's not just someone like me who's coming in from outside who's learning it. So representing, if you don't show resistance, and this is similar to the situation with enslaved people in the Caribbean and the southern states, that the stories of the rebellions are often not told, so it makes it look as if the people who are being suppressed are just passive, implying they didn't fight, but they did. And certainly all these stories are now coming forth and often tell of horrendous massacres, and we'll cover that more in a minute. So it's really important.
Liz, you're not sharing your screen at the moment. Were you intending to?
Oh, right. Let me just go back a minute then. Thank you very much indeed for that explanation. Escape from that. Right, so I go back into there. Apologies, everybody. Can I do? Oh, hi, Professor Sati. But yeah. Right, can you see now?
Yes, yes.
Right, okay. Apologies then. So quickly then, National Reconciliation Week. The resistance wars, we talked about that. The massacres which have gone on also over the years, populations devastated, Indigenous people dehumanized by the colonizers, horrific acts, devastation of culture. In many cases, the events resulted in the loss of also cultural knowledge as our entire generations of family groups were murdered. One of the things that's really interesting is that we have all these problems in Australia about fire, and yet the Indigenous people knew how to deal with fire. And now that knowledge is having to almost be relearned and reintroduced by the Indigenous communities to help us all not to have to experience such tragedies. The truth's been left out, and one of the things that they're looking at now is truth telling. So that's an important focus as well. And many people are shocked to realise that, you know, the place that you live, the suburb that you live in, it may have been a place where there's been such an awful history. Then another part of Australian history that I've learnt about and visited one of the missions and reserves in Central Australia was the way that the missionaries came in and created these mission centres and then tempted people with food and opportunities and changed their way of life to come into the mission stations and the reserves. So today still there are people who remember the effects of the missions and the reserves, still living with the trauma and stories of abuse in the different situations. The reserves also meant that people were displaced from the land they owned, and that's another tragedy. The intergenerational transmission of poverty is also a problem, and issues of poor nutrition issues of alcoholism, health problems, inadequate education. A lot of effort is being put in by central government to do things, but often there are still inherent problems. And another aspect of the history over here were the stolen generations, where children were forcibly removed from their families as part of a policy of assimilation. And the stolen generation again have difficulties with identity, the trauma of being taken from their families, brought up by white families, often expected to do menial tasks and work for the family. And there are still people alive today. I've spoken to people from the stolen generation, and there's so much to heal there, and in some cases almost impossible to heal. So the impacts left a legacy of trauma, loss, self-destructive behaviour, lifestyle diseases. As I say, there's so many problems, and the level of incarceration of people from Indigenous communities is extremely high and of extreme concern. There's also the disruption of passing on the culture, devastation really, and then problems of people from the stolen generations then not having lived in their own family and learn parenting skills. And this is causing problems now because the state is taking children away from families because they aren't caring for them properly. And it's almost like, you know, replicating the situation of the stolen generation again. Apparently, in exemption certificates are also forced on many Indigenous people. The stories are just so hard, and to realise that only now are people beginning to be more respectful and try to heal, try to find out the truth and to heal. And there's no end of exploited labour was going on, people who weren't paid properly. And I listened to an interview of a woman who had been taken into service but wasn't paid her full wage, and her wage apparently, which she was told was given to the state, part of the wage she was only given a few pounds, and then she was told that it wasn't possible to reclaim that when she became 21. She should have been able to. Then social exclusion, deprived from taking part in the mainstream social system because of all these rules and regulations that were put in, and also institutional discrimination way back to the 1880s and still today. So all sorts of problems. So the mayor of Yarra Ranges, a wonderful woman, said in one of the interviews, "We all need to be custodians of this land we call home. We need to ignite a shared responsibility, one that captures the principles of Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. Together we can build our resistance so we can face challenges such as climate change and COVID. And we can all embrace the strength of country to build a future for a united society that recognises the special place and culture of Indigenous peoples as the first Australians and value their participation and provide equal life chances for all." So the intention seem right. It's just, is it really making the difference? So one of the things that's happening now, and this was launched just a few weeks ago, is the truth and justice process that's going to go on here in Victoria. Victoria is the first of the states to announce that it had established a truth and justice process, looking to recognise historic wrongs and address the ongoing injustices for Aboriginal Victorians. Because at times it's difficult if you're not familiar with the communities here. we're all living together. There are places where Aboriginal people live on their own, and the Torres Strait Islanders live on their own in their own communities. But there's a great deal of when I spoke to Gary, who's the Yarra Ranges development officer supporting the Aboriginal communities. He's from the local group here, and he lives near here. There's a place called the Patch. It's like the next suburb to Sassafras. So we're all living together. So it's understanding one another better. So the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria is also working out how the process will operate. And today there's a co-chairing of the process to be run by what's called the Uluru Justice Committee. And that's a name in the Wemba Wemba or Wamba Wamba word for truth. Spelling of Aboriginal names is often complex because different ones spell them in different ways using our forms of spelling. So the commission is going to be led by 5 commissioners, and importantly will be invested with the powers of a royal commission. So that's the highest level you can do things here. So today has been owed for 233 years. The statement is that 233 years of violence, dispossession and deprivation, 233 years of deliberate silence, but today, a commitment to tell the truth. We do that for the kids who never came home and those who are still finding their way back, for those who were told that they were not allowed to speak their own language, practice their own culture or know their own identity. Colonialisation in many parts of the world, we hear the same things, don't we, over and over again. But for families who lost loved ones in massacres, for those who made like that they didn't belong in their own country, and for those who still feel this way. So the Victorian State Government, working with the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, commit to telling their truth. We do so in partnership, and this tells you exactly how that'll work. This is going to be held independently from government and afforded the full power of the Royal Commission. And it'll compel us to confront what's come before, to acknowledge the pain in our lives, in our present, and to recognise that without truth, without justice, there can be no treaty. So they're looking to develop a treaty, as treaties have been created in other places. So how else are things happening? Well, attitudes are changing slowly, and I've been visiting here for the last 14 years or so. And I first bumbled into Australia Day thinking, oh, this is a good opportunity to find out how people who's living here and what Australia Day is all about. Well, it's actually on the day when Captain Cook invaded Australia. So the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, not of other Australians, call it Invasion Day now, and it's not an appropriate day for a celebration. It's felt to be a more appropriate National Day of Mourning on 26th of January. So there are different views on this, and every year I've been here, there are always discussions and arguments about this, but things are changing. So this year, for example, thousands of people in Australia defied public health concerns. COVID was there. We were being told that we shouldn't meet in big groups, but still there were protests against the mistreatment of Indigenous people. And having a national holiday marking the 1788 arrival of the British fleet really is so tactless. And yes, many people call it Invasion Day. And many people remind those of us who've come to live in this place that you're on stolen land. Decolonise your minds, because Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So there's an awful lot of very, very powerful information that you can find out more about this, and I'm spending my time while I'm over here and as I can, and to help my little granddaughter I've got this book here, Finding Our Heart, all about the Uluru Statement from the heart, so that together Tilly and I are learning about the history here and trying to put it in the context of colonial history around the world. So I've done what I promised, and that was to tell you about the history over here. And apologies that I wasn't able to get someone else to come and join me, but that'll be a time for the future. Thanks then. So any questions, any comments, any similarities? Yes, Professor Satie.
Thank you very much, Liz. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, reasonably.
Okay. The presentation is quite interesting for me as a historian because of the so much comparative and contrasting features in Australia's history and that of Africa. In several respects, it means that the pattern of colonialism in Africa and in Australia, the pattern is quite similar by way of how Europeans or the colonizer went to different parts and claimed them as if people did not exist there. I first came across the term terra nullus from a book, and it was trying to describe how Europeans had perceived Africa and said it was almost like a no man's land, and that they were conquering virgin lands. And I can see the same thing happening in Australia. So it means there was some kind of living in denial by the conqueror, denying that other people existed before they came there. And this is quite unfortunate. And the patterns of resistance, the massacres, they're also very similar in African history. The reserves remind me of how we created Abuja City in Nigeria, but quite a little bit different from the Australian case. There are so-called native settlements inside Abuja. So in the highbrow areas, some places are just left for the indigenous people to live their lives. So they live as if they're in their village. So within Abuja town, there are villages, and it reminds me of the reserves, although the reserves in Australia are slightly different. So in Nigeria, they say they deliberately don't want to destroy the indigenous people. They still want to leave relics of them. They still want to have them around, but for the purpose of exploiting them, which is to provide labor for the people that live in the big houses, to use them as domestic workers, to find certain things that they can find from them. So they left them there for the purpose of exploitation. So what you have presented is quite interesting to me. The only difference perhaps is this process of ongoing process of reconciliation. Africans fought the colonialists and drove them away through the nationalist process, whether by constitutional means or by armed struggle, as it did occur in Algeria, Angola, Mozambique. But the reconciliation process that is beginning to recognize the indigenous people, Aboriginal people in Australia, is quite interesting to me. And I hope that when it is taken to the next level, as we say in Nigeria, the Aboriginal people will have the voice that they are talking about, they will have the recognition that they are talking about, and they will be restored to the community of human beings that they deserve.
Yes, thank you. That's certainly what so many people here are hoping. But it's really interesting what you said about the patterns of colonialization, because colonialization started here in 1788. So in a way, the British were practicing colonialization here in Australia, and they'd got their penal colonies and the way that they were doing things. And then the same patterns are reflected, you're saying, in the way that colonialism was approached in Africa. And I think to me, that those patterns that go around the world and stories that are told around the world. And one story that I found very distressing here was that smallpox was introduced, and apparently the ships carried smallpox scabs, which are highly infectious. The ships carried smallpox scabs. Blankets were infected with the smallpox scabs and were passed to the native people here. And that same story is told in America as well. So Lisa's asking a question as well. Oh. So Lisa, have you heard that story about the smallpox? Lisa? Hi. Okay, Lisa, we'll keep coming back to you every few moments and see if you can hear. Because I mean, that's the first time I heard that, I was just so distressed to hear that story. But then you also know it's happened in other places, and the so many other things have been reflected around the world. Lisa's disappeared now. Hi, Seema.
Hello. Yeah, I'd not heard of that before. That's really shocking. I'd really never heard of that before. So I can imagine it, definitely happening, but yeah, that's horrific. That's really horrific.
And the Stolen Generation story is particularly poignant. There's a film that you may have seen on TV, The Rabbit Proof Fence. The bright ideas they had in Australia to stop the rabbits going from the plague proportions they were at in the east, I think, to prevent them going into the west. They had this rabbit-proof fence, supposedly. And these little girls were taken to onto one of the missions to be educated there and to learn how to be able to help in white people's houses and work on farms. And they managed to get away, and they knew that their parents lived near the rabbit-proof fence. So they found the rabbit-proof fence, and it's a true story. It took weeks, months for them to make their way and to keep themselves hidden while the rangers were trying to find them. And they did manage to get back, and they did manage. There were three of them. Two of them got back, and one of them got caught again and got returned. But two of them stayed with the family, and of course, then the family were just terrified to keep them hidden. But they grew to be older women. I think one lady's still alive. So it's not outside of so many difficult stories that are replicated many other countries. And it's interesting when we're looking at Black history, we've concentrated on all sorts of other things, but we haven't looked at First Nations people's stories, and I think that would be really interesting to look at in future. So we'll see these similarities. And Professor Sati, your points, if we can see commonality, it almost helps us to understand it better. And I don't know whether it helps us to come to terms with it, but it's the truth, it's what happened, and it needs to be told and explained.
It's very similar, isn't it, to Canada? Sorry, it's the story of Canada as well. So it must have been, like Dr. Sati is saying, it must have been kind of a system that they had in place that they replicated in different places, which, yeah, it's horrible. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, it is horrible. And I mean, we talk about, a number of, nothing in Black history is good news, really. It's so hard. Lisa's coming back in, so we'll try and pick up on her question, her point. Lisa, can you hear us?
Yes, finally. Oh my goodness, I had to join from my phone. My computer decided it was time to go ahead and shut off. So never worse timing. I'm sorry. So I'm back, but I'm on my phone now. So I missed a bit of conversation, but before I lost you guys, I just wanted to say, just as Professor Sati had mentioned, this pattern of colonization, all of this rings so true in North America as well. And also in New Zealand, this idea that land is not being used properly, so it's appropriate to go ahead and take it so that it can better be taken advantage of. That's sort of a justification pattern that I see all over the world. And interestingly, even after independence, and Americans had an opportunity to take our country in whatever direction they chose, they began a pattern of colonization also as we moved westward and began the same claims that Indigenous tribes were not using the land properly, and so they needed to be assimilated and taught how to live properly and things such as this. So this idea of colonization is one that we just see over and over and over. And so it's sad and interesting at the same time to wrap your brain around how we could just do this continually throughout history.
Yes, and to have the vocabulary to be able to talk about it. I mean, I've had to learn some new expressions, and it's very difficult, but we can, next year, we can maybe look at different stories. But what else is interesting in Black history is to know the stories of the First Nations before colonization, and that's very valid. And that's partly we've done some work in learning about the history of Africa before colonization. That wasn't the start of history, so we should do that. Okay,
Yes.
well,
Could I ask you a question about more recent Australian history? I mean, the idea that, I'm not sure if this was a legal term or not, but the idea that Australia was a white dominion, and I think the same phrase was applied in Canada and New Zealand. And then there were I know so little about this, but I know there was an official policy of keep Australia white, which is how can you keep something white that hasn't been white? It seemed to be just a complete blindness, not just a suppression of the Indigenous peoples, but this view in some important sense, they didn't exist. It had always been white. When did these terms and that policy stop being used?
I think the White Australia policy went on, certainly I think in the 50s, if not the beginning of the 60s. I'd really have to Google and check that. So you'll find that it's called the White Australia policy. And it's true. And there were all kinds of ways that the White Australia policy was implemented, like having tests in English, asking the sorts of questions that people who weren't English might not know. And in Melbourne, I've not been in the last 18 months because things have all been shut down, but there's a fantastic migration museum. Lisa and I went when Lisa came over to Melbourne to have a look at the immigration museum, and that tells the White Australia story and how utterly unreasonable it was, because there'd been a lot of incomers into Australia, particularly for the gold rush and at other times. So we had many people from all over the world who'd come into Australia, but there was efforts to get rid of them, as well as to have this White Australia policy, which takes a lot of believing. I was really genuinely surprised by it.
Maybe just a quick point here, and that is that in world history, there have been episodes of this sort of supremacist or racist doctrines that people have applied. If in the 50s there was White Australia only as a policy of trying to eliminate the other races, you would remember that it was this kind of racist thinking that accounted for anti-Semitism This was why the Jews were massacred in large numbers by Hitler, and then the Germanization policy. And then in Russia, after the Bolshevik Revolution, part of what led to resistance in Eastern Europe was the attempt to make everybody a Russian. And they call it the Russification policy. And then if you look at the Boers, the Dutch that went to South Africa, they prided themselves as a pure race, that there is no race as good as theirs. So at different points, there is this kind of nationalism that is racist inclined, and it has driven some nations to the extreme by regarding others as not human beings. Of course, part of this, as I did say earlier, came from Europe's achievement of the Industrial Revolution. Once they became industrialized, they just thought that all other human beings are inferior. So colonialism is one of the darkest parts of our history, just as the slave trade. And I think what Australia is doing by this reconciliation process is what other nations should copy and give voice to the indigenous people, because the mistakes, the errors created by white supremacists in those days, the problems created by colonialism, it's very unlikely for us to correct them. But the correction is to admit that we are all human and that we can together as a human community move together again.
Yes, that's just so true. It's so true. And here in Australia, with some of the ceremonies I've been to, they have Invasion Day ceremonies. I've been to a few of those. I mean, which it shouldn't have to be. It's 2021. Why are we still having to say that we need to treat others as being fellow humans? I mean, it's ridiculous. The Migration Museum I mentioned earlier, though, that is fascinating because that does analyse racism as well. It has the whole floor. It's a large museum over, I think, 3 or 4 floors. There's a whole floor which just focuses on challenging racism and what does racism look like and how can you deal with a racist incident on the tram or on the train. It's very practical as well as being very informative, and there's different activities and exercises you can participate in. Lisa, do you remember visiting? I know it was a very brief visit, wasn't it?
Yes, it was very profound. I thought it was very well done. And Professor Sethi, what you said about just beginning the dialogue, I do feel as though, I mean, Liz, you may not feel as though there's much progress being made in Australia, but as a person visiting from another country who's watching that struggle not move nearly as quickly, I think Professor Sethi is right. Australia is doing a great job of beginning this dialogue and this process in a way that I don't see in other places or in places that I have traveled to. So yes, that was a great museum that was making excellent efforts to start this dialogue.
Yes, it's interesting because in the UK, for example, we don't have an immigration museum. There is a migration museum in London, but it's not even got a permanent base, and it's hosted its exhibitions in different places. And yet, Britain's got a big history of immigration. But certainly here, I was really interested to see this, head-on challenge. Curated in such an interesting way. It's a very, very powerful messages there. So great. So I think we'll be touching base on this one again, and we'll be hearing also about colonial patterns of colonialization in other areas and looking at other similarities. one thing I'm fascinated with is buildings, that you can see the same building in different countries around the world, depending which colonial power was passing those design plans on. So thanks ever so much, everybody. Thank you. Okay, so if you finish recording now, and just to say thanks very much for you all for being patient and listening through, and for those very pertinent comments. Thanks ever so much, everyone.